Naomi Carter stood tall in the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her heart beat steadily, almost as if her body had become accustomed to the nerves that always crept in during moments like this. Today wasn't her first run-in with the law, but it was a different kind of challenge. This wasn't about her. This was about the future she hoped to shape for thousands of children who were denied equal opportunities in education, a future she believed could be possible with the right reforms. The courtroom was quiet except for the sound of the judge's voice, his tone firm and unwavering. Naomi Carter, you've been found in violation of local ordinances due to your unauthorized demonstration in the public square. I understand your passion for your cause, but the law cannot be ignored, regardless of intent. Judge Charles Davis, in his neatly pressed black robes, looked at her with the kind of authority that only decades of experience on the bench could bring. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked briefly over his notes as if he had already made up his mind. Naomi kept her posture straight, refusing to look down. She had seen this look before, the cold, dismissive gaze of someone who believed in the status quo and resented any challenge to it. She'd been through enough in her life to know that this was not a personal battle for her. This was just another obstacle in a much larger fight. The judge continued, "The fine for these actions is set at $500. I expect this to be paid within 30 days. Should you fail to comply, further legal action will be taken." He slammed his gavel down with a finality that echoed through the room. A low murmur of tension rippled through the gallery, and Naomi could feel the eyes of the spectators on her, many of them sympathetic to her cause. She wasn't alone in her fight. Others had rallied beside her, united in the belief that the education system needed a complete overhaul. But for now, it seemed that her efforts had been reduced to a simple fine, a slap on the wrist in the eyes of the law. Naomi refused to let the sting of the decision show on her face. This was only the beginning. As she walked out of the courtroom, the heavy doors swinging shut behind her, Naomi felt an unfamiliar sense of calm settle over her. She wasn't sure if it was the weight of the fine or something deeper, perhaps the weight of knowing that she was making an impact. In the face of the system's resistance, Naomi was more determined than ever to continue pushing forward. The battle for educational reform had just begun, and as she left the courthouse, a quiet but powerful resolve took root in her heart. This wasn't the end, but rather the first chapter in a story that was only beginning to unfold. Naomi Carter's journey didn't start with courtrooms or public demonstrations. It started long before that, in a small, modest neighborhood where she was raised. Her mother, a dedicated public school teacher, often came home exhausted, her eyes heavy with the weight of a system that barely provided enough resources for her students. Naomi could remember the quiet frustration that would fill their small home when her mother spoke about her struggles in the classroom, overcrowded classrooms, outdated textbooks, and the constant pressure to do more with less. But it was never just the lack of resources that troubled Naomi. It was the reality that children like her, kids from working-class families, children of color, seemed to always get the short end of the stick. Naomi had always excelled in school, but not without noticing the gaps. She saw how her classmates, who didn't have access to the same resources or support, often fell behind. She could still recall the way her best friend, Jasmine, struggled with basic reading comprehension, even though she was just as sharp and curious as Naomi. Jasmine's family couldn't afford tutoring, and the schools weren't equipped to provide the help she needed. Naomi's heart ached at the inequality she saw day after day, and she vowed to do something about it. When Naomi graduated from college, she didn't take the typical path that many of her peers did, joining corporate firms or pursuing lucrative careers. Instead, she returned to her hometown, determined to make a difference. She began working with local community organizations, organizing workshops, and advocating for policy changes that would bring more attention to the issues facing public schools, particularly those in underserved communities. It was there that her passion for education reform truly ignited. Naomi's vision for a new federal education system was clear. She wanted to dismantle the barriers that perpetuated inequality. She envisioned a system where funding was equitably distributed, where curriculum was inclusive of all cultures and histories, and where teachers were not only valued but properly supported. She dreamed of a school system where every child, regardless of their background, had access to the same quality education. Her movement began small: workshops, meetings with parents, petitions, but it quickly grew as others who shared her concerns found their voices in Naomi's cause. Teachers, students, parents, and even some education experts came forward, all of them united by one common belief: the current system was broken, and it needed to change. With every conversation, Naomi's resolve only deepened. She knew it wasn't going to be easy. The challenges were immense, and there would be resistance from many who profited from the way things were. But Naomi had something that no amount of money or influence could buy: a vision of a better future for children everywhere, and the determination to fight for it, no matter what. The rally she had organized, despite the court's decision, was just one of many steps in her journey, and she was only just getting started. After Naomi's court appearance, something unexpected happened. The fine, which many thought would be the final blow to her cause, instead sparked a fire. News outlets began covering her case, not just as a legal matter, but as part of a larger conversation about the state of education in America. What had been a small rally in her local community turned into a national talking point. People who had never heard of Naomi Carter began looking into her work, discovering her vision for an education system that would be fair for all children, not just those lucky enough to attend well-funded schools. Social media exploded with support. Hashtags like #EducationForAll and #NaomiCarter4Change began trending, as students, teachers, and parents alike shared their stories of underfunded schools, overcrowded classrooms, and outdated resources. Naomi's face was suddenly everywhere: on news channels, on blog posts, in interviews with educators and activists. Her ideas, once considered radical by some, were now being seen by many as essential. Her rallying cry, "Every child deserves a quality education," was something that resonated with people across the country. In the days following the rally, Naomi received hundreds of messages. Some came from educators who had been teaching for decades, tired of watching their students struggle because the system wouldn't support them. Others came from parents who had been fighting for better schools in their neighborhoods, but felt like they were up against an immovable force. They all expressed their gratitude for Naomi's bravery, for standing up when so many others were too afraid to rock the boat. Even the media coverage began to shift. What had initially been framed as an act of civil disobedience was now being seen as the beginning of a movement. Naomi wasn't just fighting against local ordinances, she was fighting against a system that many believed was failing. And suddenly, more people were ready to fight alongside her. Naomi's phone rang constantly. She found herself speaking with activists from other cities who wanted to organize similar rallies, pushing for education reform in their own states. There were emails from nonprofit organizations offering to help fund her efforts, and even messages from a few sympathetic politicians asking how they could support her cause. What had started as a small local initiative now seemed like something much bigger, something that could change the entire landscape of education in America. But with the momentum came new challenges. Naomi found herself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of requests, messages, and media appearances. As much as she appreciated the growing support, she knew that maintaining this momentum meant she needed to be strategic. She couldn't do it all herself. And yet she couldn't ignore the feeling in her gut. This was just the beginning. Naomi wasn't just starting a movement, she was shaping the future of education. She felt the weight of the responsibility, but also the exhilarating rush of knowing that change was finally within reach. Judge Charles Davis sat alone in his chambers, the weight of the gavel still lingering in the air long after Naomi Carter had left the courtroom. His decision had been final, but as the hours passed, he found himself replaying the scene over and over in his mind. Naomi's calm demeanor, her unwavering resolve. It had stayed with him. In all his years on the bench, he had seen countless cases, each one with its own nuances, its own story. But this one felt different. His job was clear: uphold the law, maintain order, and ensure that justice was served. But what did justice truly mean when it came to someone like Naomi? She wasn't just fighting for her own rights. She was fighting for something much bigger. The fine he had imposed seemed so small in comparison to the enormity of her cause. And though he tried to push it aside, the nagging thought kept creeping back. Had he done the right thing? Judge Davis had always prided himself on his fairness, on being impartial. But as he sifted through the media coverage of Naomi's rally and her subsequent legal troubles, he began to see things in a new light. He saw the stories of struggling schools, of underpaid teachers, of children left behind because their families didn't have the same privileges as others. He read the powerful articles about systemic issues in the education system that Naomi had spoken about so passionately. These were not just abstract problems. These were real people, real families, real communities fighting for something that should have been their right all along. The more he read, the more his perspective shifted. He wasn't naive enough to think that everything Naomi proposed could be fixed overnight. The education system was a labyrinth of policies, budgets, and bureaucracy, all entrenched in decades of tradition. But could it really be that broken? Could the current system, one that he had always upheld without question, actually be failing so many? Judge Davis had grown up in a different time, one where he had believed the system worked for most people. It was a system that rewarded hard work and perseverance. But now, reading through Naomi's vision of reform, he began to wonder if that same system was inadvertently leaving others behind, people who had the same drive, the same potential, but lacked the resources to realize it. As he sat at his desk, surrounded by case files and legal books, Judge Davis felt a quiet discomfort settle in his chest. This wasn't just about following the law anymore. It was about what the law represented. And suddenly, the idea of reforming the education system didn't seem so far-fetched. It seemed necessary. Naomi Carter had made him question the status quo, and for the first time in years, Judge Davis wasn't sure if he had all the answers. The thought of reaching out to her crossed his mind, perhaps to understand her cause better, to have a conversation. But would she even want to talk to him after everything that had happened in the courtroom? For the first time in a long time, Judge Davis didn't have all the answers, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Naomi sat in the small office of her nonprofit organization, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. The phone buzzed again, a reminder of the countless tasks awaiting her attention, but she didn't move to answer it. She was exhausted, and the weight of the constant demands had begun to feel suffocating. Every day, there were more interviews, more meetings, more calls from politicians and activists. The media had labeled her a rising star in education reform, but to Naomi, it felt like all the attention was slowly eroding her ability to focus on the work that truly mattered. The rallies, the speeches, the media blitz. It was important, yes, but it wasn't enough. She had long ago stopped thinking of herself as the face of a movement. The cause, the children, the teachers, they were the heart of it. But even so, she couldn't help but feel the pressure of being in the spotlight, especially when the financial backing that was supposed to follow this newfound visibility hadn't materialized. The organization was barely scraping by, relying on small donations and volunteer efforts to keep going. It felt like every step forward was met with 2 steps backward. The constant juggling of resources, outreach, and policymaking was taking its toll. But Naomi wasn't one to give up. She had come too far to stop now. She knew the stakes were high. The lack of funding for public schools, the overcrowded classrooms, the outdated textbooks, these weren't just statistics to her. They were lived experiences. They were the faces of the children she'd grown up with, the children she was fighting for. How could she turn back when she had already seen too much? Late one night, after a particularly frustrating meeting with potential donors who couldn't seem to see the urgency in her vision, Naomi sat alone in the office, her thoughts swirling. The weight of the failure wasn't new to her. It was a familiar companion. Growing up, she had seen it in her mother's tired eyes, in the way she would pore over lesson plans, hoping to make a difference even when the odds were stacked against her. Naomi had inherited that resolve, that quiet determination. It was something that had been passed down, from mother to daughter, through every struggle. Naomi stood up, her mind made up. She couldn't afford to dwell on the setbacks. She had a mission, and no amount of discouragement was going to derail her. As she looked out the small window of the office, she thought about the kids who still sat in classrooms with broken windows, outdated technology, and textbooks from the last century. She thought about the teachers who, despite their best efforts, were burned out and underpaid. Tomorrow, she would meet with a group of local educators who had reached out to her, desperate for guidance. Tomorrow, she would keep pushing forward, no matter how many doors slammed in her face. Naomi wasn't just fighting for a better education system. She was fighting for the very future of those children. And as long as she had breath in her body, she wouldn't stop. Judge Charles Davis sat at his kitchen table late into the night, his dinner forgotten, the quiet hum of the clock ticking in the background. The pile of legal briefs in front of him went largely ignored as he flipped through pages of articles and research on education reform. It wasn't something he'd ever spent much time thinking about before, but now, after his interaction with Naomi Carter, everything seemed different. The image of her standing in the courtroom, calm yet unyielding, still lingered in his mind. She hadn't been just another activist or protester. There was something else about her, a quiet resolve that made her seem almost unshakable in her cause, and that, above all else, had made him question the system he had so long supported. Judge Davis had always believed in the importance of order, in upholding the law as a pillar of justice, but what he was now learning was that law and justice didn't always align. Naomi's case had forced him to confront a truth he had ignored for years. Not all laws or systems were just, especially when they worked to perpetuate inequality. For the first time in his life, the comfortable belief that everything in the legal and educational systems was inherently fair began to feel naive. He scrolled through articles about failing public schools, underfunded districts, and the ever-growing achievement gap that left so many students without the support they needed to succeed. There were numbers that painted a grim picture: hundreds of thousands of students without access to quality teachers, entire districts struggling to keep their doors open due to lack of funding, and millions of children trapped in a cycle of educational inequity. The stark statistics were hard to ignore, but what struck him most was the personal side of the issue. The faces of the children, the teachers, the parents. For so long, Judge Davis had seen the world through the lens of legal cases, procedures, judgments, precedents. But now, the reality Naomi spoke of seemed personal. He thought about his own daughter, now a teenager, who had been fortunate enough to attend one of the best schools in the district. She had never wanted for anything: quality teachers, extracurricular activities, college prep programs. But what if she hadn't been so lucky? What if she had been born in a different neighborhood, with fewer resources and less opportunity? His thoughts drifted back to Naomi's rally and her words, how she spoke about an education system that was designed to work for some but not all. It was a truth he had never really seen before, not through the lens of his position. The judge leaned back in his chair, the weight of his realizations settling over him. He wasn't sure what to do with this newfound awareness, or how it would affect his future decisions, but he knew one thing for certain: the way he viewed education, and perhaps even his own role within the legal system, had irrevocably changed. The next morning, he sat at his desk, pen in hand, writing a letter to Naomi Carter. He wasn't entirely sure what he would say yet, but he knew that something needed to change, and perhaps this was the first step. Naomi sat at the small coffee table in her apartment, her laptop open in front of her, but her attention elsewhere. The weight of the last few months was beginning to take its toll. Her movement had gained traction. She'd spoken at rallies, written op-eds, and even had a few meetings with policymakers. Yet despite the swelling support, the road ahead felt daunting. There was so much work to do, and too little time. The phone calls and emails, while encouraging, never seemed to stop. The rallying cries for change were growing louder, but Naomi knew that real change wasn't just about raising awareness. It was about strategic action, about crafting policies that would make a difference. That's when her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was a message from Judge Charles Davis. Her mind raced as she opened the email, not quite sure what to expect. The message was brief, but it carried an unexpected weight. "Ms. Carter," it began, "I've been reflecting on your work and the recent events. I would like to meet with you to discuss your vision for education reform. There's much I have learned in the past weeks, and I believe a conversation might be beneficial." Naomi's first instinct was to dismiss it. After all, this was the judge who had fined her, who had treated her rally as a mere nuisance. But then, something in his words caught her attention, specifically, the mention of learning and beneficial. Naomi had never considered that someone like Judge Davis might be open to understanding her perspective. She hesitated for only a moment before she typed a quick reply, agreeing to meet. The next morning, they sat across from each other in a small, quiet cafe, a far cry from the formal courtroom where they had first encountered each other. Naomi couldn't help but study Judge Davis as he sat across from her, his once imposing demeanor now softened by a genuine curiosity. The man who had once handed down her fine was now asking her to share her vision. "I'll be honest," the judge began, his voice calm but direct. "I was wrong to judge your actions based solely on what I saw in the courtroom. I spent the last few weeks researching the issues you've raised, and the more I've learned, the more I realize how much I've overlooked." Naomi leaned forward, intrigued by his willingness to admit his missteps. "It's not just about the issues we see on the surface," she said. "It's about a system that was designed to maintain inequality. And to fix it, we need to rethink the way education is structured from the ground up." The judge nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I agree. I've seen the data, but I've also seen the stories behind those numbers. The real impact this is having on kids, on teachers, on communities. I've spent years upholding the law, but now I wonder if the law has been protecting the wrong things." Naomi's heart skipped a beat. It was the first time anyone in a position of power had spoken about the education system in this way. She knew it wasn't going to be easy to dismantle the existing structures, but this conversation felt like a beginning. A real partnership, however unexpected it was. The next steps were unclear, but Naomi felt something stirring inside her. The judge, a man who had once stood in opposition to everything she believed, was now someone she could work with. Together, they might just be able to make the changes this country's education system so desperately needed. Naomi and Judge Davis sat side by side at a large conference table in a room filled with educators, lawmakers, and community leaders. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, as if everyone in the room knew they were on the cusp of something bigger than any of them had imagined. The judge, a figure who had once been so entrenched in the legal system, now sat at the table as an ally, a surprising but crucial ally in Naomi's fight for education reform. Over the past few months, they had met regularly, hammering out a detailed proposal for comprehensive educational reform. Judge Davis, with his legal background and deep understanding of policy, had helped shape the framework, while Naomi brought the heart and passion of the grassroots movement. They had spent countless hours poring over research, connecting with experts, and listening to those directly affected by the issues they sought to address. Teachers who were underpaid and overworked, students who struggled in overcrowded classrooms, and parents who felt powerless to change the system. Their plan had begun to take shape. Proposals for equitable funding models, restructuring the curriculum to reflect the diverse needs of students, and providing teachers with the resources and support they so desperately needed. There were still hurdles ahead, but the blueprint was strong. What had once seemed impossible, two people from vastly different worlds coming together to push for change, was now a very real possibility. As Naomi looked around the room, she saw that the support was growing. The idea that education could be reimagined wasn't just a dream anymore. It was becoming a shared goal. There was a sense of unity in the air, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The countless hours of struggling alone, the countless setbacks, were all worth it now. Her vision, once so fragile and uncertain, had found solid ground. Judge Davis stood up to address the group, his voice steady, but there was a new energy in his tone, a kind of fervor that Naomi had never expected from him. "I've spent my career in the courtroom, delivering judgments and following the law. But I've come to realize that the law must evolve with society," he began. "We are faced with a system that has long been out of step with the needs of our children, and it's time we made the changes necessary to ensure every child has access to the education they deserve." The room was silent for a moment before a round of applause broke out. Naomi looked at Judge Davis, a smile of gratitude spreading across her face. She had never expected this partnership, but it was exactly what they needed. The judge had not only acknowledged the flaws in the system, but was now using his position to fight for real change. The battle was far from over. There would be resistance, there would be setbacks, but Naomi knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning. They would continue to push, continue to challenge the system, and continue to fight for a future where every child could reach their full potential. And together, they would make it happen. The road ahead was long, but with each step, they were getting closer to the change they had dreamed of.